So I guess, like Olivia, I chose also to look at a section of the population that was often overlooked by historians and even contemporary historians throughout the Roman ages, and that would be the slaves. So due to the unique nature of Pompeii and the incredible level of preservation that we have because of the eruption, we are able to get a unique glimpse into the lives of these people that, like I said, are often overlooked. So slavery was a big facet of Roman culture ever since the foundations of Rome. The earliest stories of King Romulus tell of how him and his people would go to neighboring tribes and would conquer them and take those people as slaves. But one thing to keep in mind in regards to Roman slavery is that it's completely unlike American notions. Slavery has no connection to race whatsoever. So often in early Roman slavery, people were conquering other Italians so that Italians would be the slaves of other Italians. The most common role of slaves that we have record for in Pompeii was just general laborers, and unfortunately the least amount of evidence survives for that. Slavery in the Roman Empire was not the sole reserve of cities, however, it was often common throughout the empire and in the country. Slavery also was not necessarily the preserve of the elite, so it was not uncommon for small business owners to have at least one or two slaves in their household, and often they would just work as like household help, kind of what you would think of like as maid. Slaves also were not required to dress in any particular way that would denote them as slaves, so they were often quite invisible in the Roman population. You could not walk down the street and pick one person out as a slave and the other not, unless they were wearing something like this. I've included a picture of a bracelet, which inside has the inscription of the name of the slave along with the name of their owner. Unfortunately, artifacts like this are not terribly uncommon, and it is sad to think of people wearing artifacts that are similar to what we would think of as dog collars. Basically, they list the name of the slave, their owner. If found, please return to this address. So I think that's a very harrowing artifact to be reminded of, that these people were very dehumanized. Also, different than American notions of slavery, manumission was not uncommon in the Roman world. And there's a large population of freedmen throughout Pompeii. You can tell often in graffiti if it was a freedman or a slave because slaves did not have the legal authority to use the trinomia system, which was how you could denote a Roman slave from a freeborn Roman. Instead of having three names like a freeborn Roman would, slaves typically had one or two names. So on graffiti you can see like Gaius wrote this, and you can sometimes assume that that was a freedman or a slave. Upon being manumitted, slaves would be given the first two names of their owners so that they would always have that mark with them for the rest of their lives and would stay in the owner's familia, which is their family system of protection and authority. But freedmen had the possibility, after they were freed, to gain much recognition. A couple of the largest homes that we have record for in Pompeii were owned by freedmen, such as the house of the Vidya, and we know that, like I said, because it is inscribed that this is the home of these two people, and their names indicate that they were freedmen. There's also other records that indicate throughout the city that these freedmen had worked in business, and that's how they gained their money to build this extremely lavish home. We also have an interesting case that was preserved from Pompeii. It was a case of a lawsuit. A mother had been enslaved in the household of her master and had given birth to a child. At some point in history, this mother had been manumitted by her master, and she left her daughter in the household because they just kind of lived together after that. She just stayed on as more of like a helper instead of a slave. And the lawsuit focuses on whether or not the daughter was born after she was manumitted or not. So she would have, of course, the same social position as her mother. And so there's lots of preserved tablets that actually indicate the back and forth nature of this ongoing lawsuit. But unfortunately, the lawsuit was not finished by the time of the eruption. So we have no idea of knowing if and when it was actually completed. And and what the outcome would have been. Slaves in Pompeii could also expect to have very little privacy. There are only 2 homes that have records of slave quarters. So these slaves were often living in very close proximity to their masters, and were often sleeping just wherever they could find a place. Unfortunately, very few furniture remains from Pompeii, so we don't know exactly where they would sleep, and that goes for freed Roman and enslaved Romans. There's very little bed furniture remaining. But the slave quarters also had very little decoration as compared to most of the rest of the houses, which were very lavishly painted and had very open air. The slave quarters that we do have are very dark, very undecorated, and so it's very clear to see that these people were definitely seen as other or less than. So along with the inability to use the Roman trinomia, slaves were not allowed to have legally recognized marriages. So instead of having what was called connubium, which is the word that they use for marriage, slaves had to use the term contubernale, which actually is an army term, and it comes from the word tent sharer. So these people were able to create their own system in which they could live as husband and wife in a system that didn't recognize that. So there are actually records of tombs which indicate when being dedicated to my contubernale. And so it's very interesting how, even though they did not have these legal abilities, that they created a system that would help them be as fulfilled as possible. Slaves also performed a wide variety of roles outside of the domestic sphere in Pompeii. Perhaps the most famous is as gladiators. So gladiators would have been commonly slaves, but oftentimes criminals that were set to die. Gladiators are often incredibly famous. There are records of them basically being the celebrities and the heartthrobs of their day. When graffiti reads, "The girl's heartthrob, the Thracian gladiator Salatus." So you can see that these people were held in a very weird limbo state as famous heartthrobs, but also not even allowed to have a name or a husband or a wife. And Pompeii has one of the largest gladiator skull remains that is available to see today. It housed about 30 to 40 cells, so that's where the gladiators would train as well as they would live there. And the arena of Pompeii was very famous. There was actually a fight that broke out at one of the gladiator games in Pompeii that caused gladiators to be banned from Pompeii for about 20 years because several viewers got harmed. And one of the more famous slave revolts in Roman history was the Spartacus Revolts. And Spartacus and his army escaped their gladiator school near Capua and escaped and hid out on Mount Vesuvius outside of Pompeii. So there are records that Spartacus called for other slaves to come join him in his hideout, so one can only assume that some of the slaves of Pompeii went and joined Spartacus in his slave revolt. This is a graffiti that was found on a home, and this figure on the right above it in Oscan, which is the traditional Pompeian language, is Spartacus. So we can see that this is part of their legend that they really held to and to decorate with. And another unfortunate aspect of Roman slavery is once you were a slave, you could be bought by whomever and forced to perform whatever tasks they had for you. And one of the largest slave populations within Rome would have been as sex workers. So Pompeii is home to only one purpose-built brothel that is known, called the Lupinar. And this is a picture of one of the cells that a prostitute would have worked in. Because unfortunately in Pompeii there were many more enslaved males than enslaved females, and so the prospects for girls was not very good. They could be bought by whomever, like I said earlier. when taken into account that the estimated population of Pompeii was 10 to 12,000 people, that meant that there was an incredibly dense red light district in Pompeii. There were 34 to 35 brothels approximately throughout the city. So it is insane to think about how many people were forced to live and work in conditions like that. This picture of the Public Minar that I included is definitely one of the largest buildings in Pompeii. It is really near the Forum and the Baths, so it has a very prominent spot in the city. And the lower floor consists of 5 small rooms called cells, which is what I've included here. And there's also lots of graffiti that just details like the names of people that worked there and the names of customers who visited as well. The person who ran a brothel, the brothel owner, was called a Lino. And the average price for a prostitute slave was around 600 sesterces. It's just sad to think that human lives can be valued so cheaply. And then graffiti also throughout the Minar includes various amounts of money transactions. So it's an interesting glimpse into not only the lives of the people of the city, but also the financial goings-on. I failed to include earlier that slaves were not typically allowed to own property. But in rare cases, slaves would be handed a small amount of property, like if they were hired out to work for other people. Oftentimes their owners would allow them to keep part of the profits for themselves. It's called a particulum, I believe, peculium. And so we do have records of some of the financial goings-on and instances of Pompeii. In incredibly rare instances, I believe it was in the household of Augustus, one of his slaves actually owned another slave. So it's this really weird limbo of having property but being considered property by your other people. And I think it was very harrowing when I was doing this research to see that throughout history people have always been overlooked and people have been treated unfairly. But fortunately, many people were able to escape this and move on to a brighter future and be able to rescue their families from the same fate that they did. Anybody have any questions?
Who can become a slave, since it's not racially based?
Mostly slaves were taken from prisoners of war throughout the empire. So anytime another colony or an area was conquered by the Romans, prisoners of war would often be taken. There are early accounts of people actually selling their own family members into slavery, and also accounts of people who owed money would be indebted and would choose to work it off through being enslaved. Yes?
Interesting point you raised about people not looking different to ordinary freeborn people. Do you think that dehumanises them, or do you think does it make them more anonymous, or do you think it makes them?
I would hope that maybe whilst they are out doing their daily chores out in the city, out in the Forum, walking around the market, that they are able to take some form of independence and pride in being able to just be invisible in the crowd and not be marked as an enslaved person. And that would hopefully give them some sense of not freedom, but individuality. Thank you very much.